All right. Hi, English 10-1 students. It's Ms. Picard coming to you with a tiny tutorial on integrating quotes and also understanding the rubric for critical analytical essay writing. And so, as always, I hope you've had a good week. I hope you're diving into your papers and coming up with lots of good questions about what it means to dive deep into a text. You only learn that by doing a lot of writing. And so if you've been experimenting and trying things out, that is the best. Maybe some of these strategies fit your style, maybe they don't. The goal here is that you learn more about how to persuade a person about your opinion while showing them that you have read and really understood and gone deep into the way that literature is put together. And I shouldn't say just literature like literature, but I mean text, any text, an image, a movie, a novel, where that's what our job is in English class, is to become better communicators. In a previous tutorial in terms of thesis creation, I stress that I'm giving you strategies, but ultimately your job is not to sound formulaic. You want to sound like you. You want to use all these strategies, yeah, try them out, but pick the things that really work for the way that you write, for your voice and personality, and also for what you need. Like, we will have different strengths and we will have different areas where we need to grow. In other words, gaps in our skills. And that's normal. And so I'm encouraging you, keep doing what you're doing, go into these videos, try things out, and remember that each of these strategies is meant to help, not interfere with sounding like you when it comes to your own writing, okay? Having said that, this strategy today about using quotes is really essential for critical analytical writing, because unlike personal writing, where you can use your own experience, talk about culture most of the time, in critical writing, any personal connection like that is possible to be in there, but it has to be more limited in scope. It's more of as your way of doing a hook to introduce your reader, or as a way of adding perspective to your conclusion, or to what you say about characters. It's not there as the focus. The focus is the text understudy. And so in order to make a persuasive argument, your supports can't just come from culture or from your own experience. Your supports really need to stick with that text that you are talking about and dive deep into the characters, what they say, what the author does with setting or with symbols. It really has to stay in the universe of that text for critical analytical writing, at least as much as possible. That doesn't mean it's personality-less, though. And so as you think about integrating quotes, my suggestion to you is not to just integrate a quote for the sake of a quote. Instead, choose the best, the brightest, the quote that makes you actually think a little more about people and how wonderful or weird or horrifying or encouraging their actions and thoughts can be. So try to look for lines. If you scroll down to the tips part here, try and look for lines that are short, lines that have power, and my suggestion is to look for lines that have poetry. In other words, some kind of image, metaphor, imagery like senses, metaphor, simile, descriptive language, something that's a little different, repetition, alliteration, there's so many, but some kind of author choice where this quote is coming alive. It's making you visualize, because those kind of quotes are the quotes that people remember, right? We remember the famous moon landing, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, because it has, even in our different understanding of gender in our society now, that idea of a small leap becoming a giant thing for a group really has power for people. We understand that a tiny action by an individual, one small step by a person on the moonscape, isn't just an American thing. It's not just a thing that was stuck in that one period of time, but that's a small step in a human scale that makes a giant leap forward in our scientific understanding, in our imagination, and what could happen if we look beyond just our one little blue planet, and also what we need to remember and hold as amazing and celebrate on our little blue planet. So that little quote, one small step, one giant leap, it has poetry in it. It has a fancy name, like it's called antithesis, but you don't need to remember that right now. What you need to do is look for that powerful thing in the play. Look for that moment that woke you up, that quote that really made you feel something for Romeo or Juliet, Or if it didn't make you feel something, you recognize and can see that it's put in there deliberately. Maybe you don't like it, but you can still recognize that's done really well, right? Okay, so that's my little tip section here, that as you're choosing quotes, you're aiming for impact. I'm suggesting you keep them really short, like a couple of words or one phrase, just because as you go on, later in your career, you might have to memorize some of this stuff for your final exams, right? And you're less likely to mess it up. In other words, you are more likely to do it right if you can keep it short and just the most powerful words, not a big giant thing. The temptation is going to be like put an entire speech into your paper, or just let a big giant quote sit on its own. But if you include too many lines, you're probably not going to be talking about them well enough. And that comes back to that balance issue of point, proof, and discussion. For every proof that you put in there, you have to spend more time, couple sentences, discussing it, not just more proof and more proof. So if you use a giant quote, imagine how much discussion has to be there. So much. Keep it simple, keep it short, sandwiched in between your own thinking so that there's no gap. There's actually, it flows into a part of your sentence, and then cite it. That means like act, scene, and line number in brackets. And just using the simple act 1 as put 1 decimal, scene 2, the number 2 decimal, and then the line number 45. So 1.2.45 in brackets. Some of you have already asked me about the differences in Shakespeare books, that not all the lines look the same. And you're so smart to notice that. I could do a whole separate lesson on why that is. The very short answer is that we only have Shakespeare's plays that were written down sort of by actors and theater companies, and a couple surviving manuscripts that were kind of, that kind of collected all from all over. And sometimes people didn't remember exactly the same wording for a line. Sometimes there was a different version of the play that was like tweaked and fixed. So we only have the play surviving in what we call folios. They're collections of work that were like folded into quadrants. So we have these collected works, but they're not all identical manuscripts. And so some books use one folio, while other books use a different version. And most of these are from after Shakespeare's death. They're from like the 1625 onward. So yeah, that's the reason that you're not crazy. There's you're not, you're noticing something you are noticing something very good. Don't panic about that. Put the quote line numbers that you see in your version of the play, and that'll be great for right now. Okay, so in terms of mechanics, quote locations go in brackets at the end of your sentence with a period after the brackets. You're going to be marking if you have a long quote, like if you can't shorten it down, then the break in the poetry, so the break in the line that you see in the script, you need to mark that with a slash, okay? So it's like your first line slash the second line. If you're using a longer, in other words, multiple line quote. If your quote is longer than 3 lines, then it becomes a block quote, and you disregard that bit about the slash and actually put it in a chunk. There's a lot of examples on this on OWL at Purdue. If you have questions, I'm going to ask you to email me if you're using those bigger quotes, because I hope that most of you are actually going to take this advice and keep it short, keep it sweet, poetry if possible, and that way you'll keep those quotes under control. Okay, now I would encourage you to look at the page 22 in your course pack, which has even more information, and also look at the excellent example in your course pack on page 26, I believe. And that'll give you a real good sense of how quotes are used effectively, okay? Now, in terms of the rubric, this is the second thing I want to do in this video, is talk to you a little bit about how this essay is assessed on our Alberta curriculum and the rubric that we scaffold across your high school years. Now, the category set here is the same as you'll see on your diploma exam. And so we have kind of 5 things that we look for in critical analytical essays. Now, these are skills that are across different outcomes in our curriculum. So in writing this essay, you're doing a lot of things. You're doing outcome 4, where you're creating a variety of texts. You're analyzing for content and context, and analyzing devices. So you're doing outcome 2 stuff. You're doing a lot of different skills. But in terms of like where the points come from and what's expected, a really good way to think about this is in terms of these 5 big areas, and to read the boxes in the rubric itself to see what skills fall under each category. roughly speaking, thought and understanding is one of the most important ones. So you can see it's weighted more heavily out of 7.5 points. And that's the ideas that you're giving, and so how insightful your thinking is about the story and the characters and the topic, especially. It's not just what happened in the story, but the topic is driving your argument. So your thought and understanding, that's how you're discussing and analyzing the text. Supporting evidence is the proofs or the parts of the text that you're integrating into your discussion. You can see it's also very important. It's worth 7.5 points because you have to be able to back up what you claim, right? You might have great thoughts, but if they're not supported by the text, you can link together all the great thoughts that you have, but they aren't what we call viable, right? They're not credible. We can't believe them unless there's enough supporting proofs that are right attached to those ideas. So supporting evidence is important. It's why this little integration of quotes video is out there. And you can think about this as the proofs. One little higher level tip, if you're looking to go on and do intensive text analysis, whether that's in the IB program or just on your own, you want to do incredible film analysis online, or you want to, write a blog post or review, or you like to write poetry. If you think about supporting evidence in terms of the specific conventions of that kind of text, it's even more helpful. So in other words, talking about film as film and giving evidence that's specific to film is a wonderful skill to work on developing. For plays, showing sometimes that you're aware of a play that's a play as a play. A play is special, a live medium, a breathed medium, one where there's stage directions given to the actors and stage crew about the setup of the location, or one that has soliloquies and monologues being used for dramatic effects. The supporting evidence is usually excellent if it's not only precise and apt and selective, so only choosing the best, but also if it keeps in mind what kind of a text you're talking about so that it's aptly chosen for that particular kind of work. Yeah, that's my little heads up, level up suggestion. For form and structure, this is organization. And so when you see that little blue section of the rubric, that's the way that your paper is sticking together. And it applies both internally to each paragraph, but also across the different paragraphs, the flow of your argument and the consistency of your focus. So it links in some ways to thought and understanding, because you have to have a really good thesis or focus idea that emerges in your paper. But form and structure is looking at the coherence and how it's transitioning and sticking together internally to a paragraph, to a section, and also across your piece. For matters of choice, this is style and voice. And so think about this in terms of your personality coming through in an appropriate way for the form that you've chosen. And so matters of choice, it should be appropriate in that you can have a personal take in critical writing, but it has to be very carefully managed, because the focus is not you, the focus is on your argument. The focus is not on your personal experience and its cultural impact as much as it is the importance of that idea for culture, yes, but specifically as shown in a text and in the culture that's shown on that page or in that image, painting, in that speech, whatever you're looking at as a text. So matters of choice is about style. It's about voice. It's about the way that you show control over the formats that you've taken on. And that means variety of your sentences. It means, can you use good diction or the word choice? Are you being specific and really focused and engaging in the way that you word things? That's kind of the stylistic features that make the presentation of your work more effective and more connected to your reader. Okay, matters of correctness is the last category, and that's what you probably think of when you're like, is my essay correct? Because that's the grammar stuff and the proofreading stuff of having, punctuation correct and having sentences be complete with subject predicates, knowing how to manage punctuations like commas or semicolons appropriately, being able to format parallel structure the right way. So there's grammar points that come into that matters of correctness. And it's not that it has to be error-free. you'll notice in the rubric that there's a line at the very end of most of these categories that talk about whether or not the errors are understandable. In other words, like we kind of get that there's going to be a couple errors. Are they distracting? Where they disrupt communication? Or are the errors like really, is the infrequency, in other words, the lack of errors, impressive given how complex a person's argument has been? So matters of correctness has that grammar part, that correctness part, spelling mistakes, all that stuff, right? Punctuation, capitalization. But it's proportional. So it's based on the complexity of what you've written, and also based on the frequency of how often those errors come up. So you could write a totally simple paper that has very basic sentence structures and write it 100% correctly. But if you haven't taken risks, and if you haven't tried other forms, you've never used a comma, or you've never tried to do a sentence longer than 5 words or a sentence shorter than 5 words, if it's always the same sounding, if you have very simple choices, then you might not get 5 out of 5 on matters of correctness, because it's about proportion of error compared to the proportion of complexity. So just be aware of that. You do want to be checking your work over, but you are also rewarded for trying more complex things, because it's harder to write a paper that's got more complex structures. So we understand that as teachers, and you're not penalized for taking risks. The idea is that it's proportional, so that if you're trying complex things and you're making complex ideas into an argument that's tied together, there's more of an understanding for there to be some errors cropping up in how perfect you're punctuating, than if you're writing very simply, not taking on a complex idea. Then there needs to be more attention paid to this being correct to get a higher score, and it might not be a 5 out of 5. So I hope that helps explain these categories, and I'm going to encourage you to go through each individually and to talk to me in the meets if you have questions about what it means to be insightful in thought, or if you have a question about supporting evidence and what it means to have a valid connection to your ideas as opposed to a sound connection, right? Sound is like, yeah, it makes sense. Valid is, oh, it holds up absolutely with your argument and with the text. So there's little subtleties in these categories in form and structure. Purpose, like you deliberately did something versus you judiciously did something. Those words really matter, because judicious means you're being careful and selective. Purposeful means you might be giving me a ton, right? Like you might be giving me tons of examples after examples. But if they start to distract from your focus, then they might disrupt form and structure. And they're not necessarily judicious arrangement of ideas and details. So you want to have the fluency, the purposefulness, translate also into a skillful and connected and well-executed argument. In matters of choice, diction you can see is a big one. Syntactic structures are like the way sentences are formed. We're looking for polish for a 5 instead of just capable, like it's really good. And for matters of correctness, again, that bolded section at the bottom where it says consider the proportion of error in terms of the complexity and length of response. That really matters when it comes to your writing, because you can do something completely, really simplistic and do it perfectly, but that might not get a 5 out of 5 because you have to try some complexity and show completeness, consistency, subordination, coordination. You have to show some of that complexity, some of those things, right? Good usage, good grammar, good mechanics across something more complicated than maybe what you did in junior high, right? In grade 6 or elementary in grade 6, right? So keep encouraged, keep on task by checking your work against the rubric to make sure you're following the advice not only of the video tutorials, but what's required in the assignment itself. And then the very last thing, on page 23 to 26, there are exemplars. There's a satisfactory, which is 3 out of 5 on most categories, and like okay, like you did okay. And an excellent, like wow, this is above and beyond, outside the box. This is what you're aiming for. And there's a couple questions that'll help you to pick out some of the good features of each that really mark each as different. So you can take a look at those and really understand what it means to write an excellent paper as opposed to a satisfactory paper. And I think that'll help you a lot. That's really it for this week. Next week, we'll talk a little bit about revision. So thank you very much for attending to the videos. And I wish you lots of happy writing in the next couple of days. Take care. And I look forward to reading your work, everybody. I'm going to shut the video down. Have a good week.